Hello, class. It is now time for our read aloud, A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements. We are currently on chapter 15. Yesterday, we left off chapter 14. It was very suspenseful. Mark had just been suspended by Mr. Maxwell. Mr. Maxwell caught him with a knife in his hand. Mark didn't even know it was a knife. It was Jason's knife that he was holding. However, Mr. Maxwell caught Mark with it, and now he has suspended Mark and told him that he can't even participate in A Week in the Woods. He hasn't even been there a day, and Mr. Maxwell plans on bringing him home. Very suspenseful. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 15 Retrial. It took Mr. Maxwell about 15 minutes to locate Mrs. Stearns. After checking over at the girls' cabins, he walked back and found her at the main lodge. Taking her aside, he explained what he had to do. "And I'm going to have to leave you in charge for a couple of hours, all right?" "My goodness," she said, shaking her head. "You'd think that boy would have more sense than to do something so stupid. But sooner or later everybody's got to learn that no means no, even when your daddy's got $500 million. I'll keep things on track here, Bill, but please hurry back." Walking along the roadway toward the gatehouse, Mr. Maxwell assured himself that he was doing the right thing. "The rules are the rules, and they've got to be obeyed," he said to himself. "I can't make an exception here, not even if I wanted to." And the odd thing was, part of Mr. Maxwell wanted to. He almost wished he could let Mark off the hook. He had watched Mark earlier during the scavenger hunt. The boy really got into it. Such a difference from the way he'd been acting in science class. Of course, lately Mr. Maxwell knew that he hadn't been any help at all, hadn't exactly been encouraging Mark to participate. He'd been stiff-arming the kid every chance he got. But watching Mark this afternoon, seeing him scramble around through the brush, laughing and shouting to his friends, Mr. Maxwell's heart had begun to soften a little. He'd been tempted to consider giving the kid another chance. Not wipe the slate clean or anything, but just ease up on him a bit and see what would happen. And now this. Mr. Maxwell kept quizzing himself, testing his motives. He asked himself, if it had been some other kid, would I have reacted like this? Or would I have just said, "Nice tool, but you better let me keep it till the week is over"? Would I? But the fact was, it wasn't some other kid. It was this kid, Mark Robert Chelmsley. And if I did let him off on this, it wouldn't be good for him. That's what Mr. Maxwell told himself, and he believed it. It was like Mrs. Stearns had said, everybody's got to learn about obeying rules, and sometimes you have to learn the hard way. At the door of the gatehouse, Mr. Maxwell paused, his hand on the knob. Looking across the wide parking lot, he could see the roof of his blue pickup, and he thought of the boy sitting in the front seat. And he thought, kid's been over there stewing in his own juices for 20 minutes now. Maybe that's been enough. Maybe he's learned his lesson. But his years of experience kicked in and said, no, discipline isn't discipline unless you follow through and make it stick. Inside, the ranger was on the phone. "Yeah, I'll hold." Covering the mouthpiece, he said, "Hey, Bill, good to see you." Mr. Maxwell nodded and smiled as he leaned across the counter and shook the man's hand. Pointing at the phone, the ranger said, "Only be a minute here." Speaking into the phone again, he said, "Hey, Tommy, it's Jim Fletcher, over at Gray's Notch." "Yeah, pretty good. Tell me, do you think you could get a vacuum truck over here tomorrow morning? I think the pit behind the main sanitary unit must have picked up some groundwater over the winter." "Yeah, been some complaints." "Yep, that's what it smells like." "Appreciate it, Tommy. See you tomorrow." Hanging up, he turned to Mr. Maxwell, smiling broadly. "Sorry I missed you this morning. Looks like a great gang of kids. Just like old times, every spring. Now what can I do for you?" "Just need to use the phone, Jim. Got sort of an emergency." "Geez, Bill, should have told me to hang up." Handing Mr. Maxwell the receiver, he said, "Here, anything I can help with? You need a vehicle or anything?" "No, no, it's not a real emergency, Jim. Just a kid who's going home. Kind of a smart-mouth rich kid. Thinks the rules are for everyone else. Little bit of a tough guy." "What? He start a fight or something?" asked the ranger. "Take a poke at you?" "No, nothing like that," said Mr. Maxwell. "He had a knife." "Geez." Kid come at you with a knife? Did he cut you? Mr. Maxwell shook his head and put his hands up. Whoa, Jim, slow down. He didn't come at me with anything. He just had on the knife with him. It's a Leatherman, one of the big ones. Mr. Maxwell took the tool out of his pocket and laid it on the counter. The ranger picked it up and took it out of its sheath. Turning it over a few times in his hands, he squinted at it. Glancing up at the teacher, he said, Geez, Bill, it isn't really that big, is it? And it's more of a tool, too. The kid's getting sent home for this? Gonna miss the whole week? Mr. Maxwell nodded. It's a weapons rule. Probably be suspended, too. No knives at any school activity. The ranger studied the tool again and then squinted up into Mr. Maxwell's face. Even here at a state park? In the woods and all? I'm not telling you how to run your program here, Bill, but that seems pretty rough. Did you give the kid a chance to say he was sorry or anything? I mean, I could talk to him if you want me to. You know, be extra serious and everything. When I get my hat on and I can look real official, throw a good scare into him if you want. What do you say? I'm sure I can get through to him. What's the boy's name? Mr. Maxwell smiled and shook his head. His name is Mark, and I thank you, Jim. But I know this kid. Somebody's got to come down hard on him. Might as well be me. Best thing for him. Would you mind stepping outside for a minute? This won't take long. It'll be a toll call, but the school will pay for it. The ranger nodded and went out the door, still holding on to the tool. When the ranger came back inside a minute later, Mr. Maxwell was talking on the phone, trying not to lose his temper. Yes, I understand that Mr. Chelmsley isn't home right now, but surely you've got a number where he could be reached. I know it's later over there, but I'm sure he'd want me to wake him up. This is important. The ranger motioned for Mr. Maxwell to cover the mouthpiece. Then he said, Bill, tell those folks you'll call him right back, okay? Mr. Maxwell shook his head. Jim, I'm handling this. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but... The ranger put his hand on Mr. Maxwell's arm and looked at him in the eye. Bill, just tell him you'll call back. Go on, tell him that. Right now. Lips pressed tightly together, Mr. Maxwell took his hand off the mouthpiece and said, Hello? Yes, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to call you back, all right? Yes, everything's fine. Yes, Mark is fine. I'll call you back. Goodbye. Turning to squarely face the ranger, Mr. Maxwell said, Jim, I know you... Bill? Said the ranger, holding up his hand. Forget all that, and just answer me one question. This boy's name is Mark. What's his last name? Chelmsley, snapped Mr. Maxwell. His last name is Chelmsley, but I've already told you... The ranger held up his hand again. Hear me out, Bill. If this boy's name is Mark Chelmsley, then what do you make of this? Handing the knife to Mr. Maxwell, the ranger pointed at the flat side of the handle. Mr. Maxwell had to hold the knife almost at arm's length, and when he did, and tilted it to catch the light, he saw what the ranger was talking about. Something was scratched into the brushed finish on the stainless steel, some crude letters. Squinting, he looked again, and the letters snapped into focus. Jason Fraser. Jason Fraser! Mr. Maxwell let out a long breath and sank into the chair at the desk. This is terrible. The ranger watched Mr. Maxwell, watched the waves of thought roll across his face. First amazement, then relief, then something that the ranger had to call pain. Deep pain. This is awful, Jim. I've been mad at this kid for weeks because he's kind of spoiled and he's got a smart mouth. And today, I jump all over him about this knife, and I'm about to send him home and get him suspended from school. And all he's doing is taking the heat for his friend. That's Jason, in his cabin. This is awful. I've got to go talk to him. The ranger nodded understandingly, both men feeling a little embarrassed at the sudden burst of emotion. Sure. Absolutely, Bill. Go talk to him. Or if you want, I'll go to his cabin and bring him so you can talk here. Be more private if you want. Mr. Maxwell nodded toward the parking lot. Thanks, but he's right over there in my truck. Been sitting there sweating bullets for half an hour now. The ranger said, Well, go on then. You've got good news for him, right? I sure do. Good news. Mr. Maxwell stood up and reached out a hand, and the ranger took it in a strong handshake. Looking the man in the face, Mr. Maxwell said, I owe you for this, Jim. I owe you a lot. Nah, forget it, Bill. Walking across the parking lot, Bill Maxwell knew what he was going to do. First, he was going to apologize. He was going to tell Mark he was proud of him. He was going to tell Mark that loyalty is just about the finest quality a person can have. He was going to tell Mark how badly he had misjudged him, About a lot of things, probably, and he was going to ask the boy to forgive him. Mr. Maxwell rounded the back of his truck, a big smile on his face, and he took 3 quick strides and grabbed the handle of the passenger side door. But then he froze. He didn't open the door, and he stopped smiling. Mark wasn't in the truck. All right. Make a great day, everyone.